I just mentioned, the rising protests around the world, including there's a big march planned for DC coming up this weekend. Well, there was a massive rally in Turkey led by Erdogan. Let's go ahead and put this up on the screen. I mean, some of these scenes, look at that. They're waving Turkish flags and Palestinian flags. Huge rally. And Erdogan, who is an Islamist, trying to, use the Palestinian cause in order to bolster his own previously rather precarious political position. But he's using extremely bellicose rhetoric here. He says accurately that Israel is committing war crimes, but he also directly floats a possible war with Israel, something that this crowd seemed to be very supportive of. He said, according to translations, quote, Israel has been openly committing war crimes for 22 days, but the Western leaders cannot even call on Israel for a ceasefire, let alone react to it. We will tell the whole world that Israel is a war criminal. We are making preparations for this. We will declare Israel a war criminal. And as I said, there was some direct sort of beating of the drums of possibly getting involved here. Turkey has a very real, very sizable military. Is obviously a NATO ally, which is also significant here as well. And Israel, in response, has withdrawn all of their diplomatic personnel from the country.
Yeah, I mean, the most important thing to understand about this with Erdogan is that prior to Erdogan's regime, the government in Turkey was much more secular. Erdogan, of course, awoke a lot of the Islamist elements inside of Turkey, and that is where his ruling coalition really comes from. So this is such an emotional issue and strikes at the heart for a lot of Muslims all across the Arab world. A lot of leaders have used that to their advantage and used the Palestinians as pawns, but that's like a second kind of piece of commentary there. In terms of this, Turkey, as you mentioned, of course, has a very world-class military, but at the same time, they're a NATO ally. So to have the fracture inside of NATO over an issue like this, and also pressure from them on the West, it also raises the question of whether they would use this issue as some sort of crux or like a wedge in future NATO negotiations. Erdogan certainly would not be above that. He's done it for his own domestic political purposes. So anyway, I'm looking at that, and I just see that as one of the most significant elements about the powers in the region. The Egyptians, of course, are going to go, in whatever direction that Sisi wants. The Jordanians are basically boxed in to go on the Palestinian side. Much of the Arab world itself, they don't necessarily want to deal with this, but they know that their populations are very activated by it. To have the Turks, come out so forcefully and to see all those people out in the streets all across the country, that's a very, very significant development.
Yeah, and of course, I mean, the utter brutality of the images that are coming out are only going to inflame those tensions. And also, the language that we played you before from Netanyahu, like overtly framing this as a sectarian religious conflict doesn't help. And, we're already seeing like mob violence.
Yeah, we're going to get to that.
Right. I mean, I mentioned the what happened at the airport. We're going to show you those images. There were also far-right Jewish extremists that were chanting death to Arabs and surrounding a college dorm inside of Israel that was housing some Arab students. I mean, when you frame things as this religious holy war, sectarian violence, these are the sorts of reactions that you get, because then you're not separating out, these are the combatants, this is a political dispute, this is how we're going to handle it. No, then anyone who is of that religion becomes your enemy. So it is an absolute horror. As we've been discussing, I sort of get irritated. There's all these leaks, the Washington Post, the New York Times, whatever, about how the U.S. is so concerned behind the scenes, and they're talking to Netanyahu, and they're trying to pressure him, oh, please turn the internet back on, et cetera. Again, not willing to actually use any of the considerable power and leverage that we have in the situation, but, they're going to ask some tough questions behind the scenes and leak it to the press. Here was John Kirby getting asked publicly, is the U.S. setting any red lines for Israel? And he gives an unequivocal no. Take a listen.
You've said you've asked them tough questions, but has the U.S. set or discussed any possible red lines?
No.
So there you go. No red lines whatsoever. There's already, like with collective punishment, with the siege that's in place on the 2.2 million civilians, you cannot argue that there's not already collective punishment and international law being violated here. So, they're saying publicly, at least, we're fine with this. And he also said something very similar to reporters, indicating that, they had not actually set any hard red lines for Israel at this point. At the same time, we've got a meeting from a high-level Saudi official that happens to coincide with this time period. Apparently, this was already previously planned, but still very noteworthy that this is happening. Go ahead and put this up on the screen. So you've heard of MBS. This is KBS. Saudi Defense Minister Khalid bin Salman is expected to visit D.C. today for talks with senior Biden administration officials. This is according to Axios Why It Matters. The visit has long been scheduled, the sources said, but it will take place just days after Israel expanded its ground operation in Gaza. An offensive Riyadh condemned on Saturday also comes as the U.S. and Saudi Arabia expressed concerns that the fighting between Israel and Hamas could widen into a regional war.
Yes.
He's expected to meet with Jake Sullivan, Lloyd Austin, Tony Blinken, and several senators, according to this report.
It's interesting. I keep coming back to this news item about how the Saudi government told the propagandists, they're like, we need to chill on any issues outside coming from Palestine. All these images, all of the babies, the stuff that we're playing. A lot of people inside Saudi Arabia, if they are getting it, it's not at the encouragement of the government. And I think what people, again, need to understand is the population's there. They don't have a lot of power. But if they all coalesce around one thing and they decide the government's not doing enough, then the Saudi royal family is going to feel as if they are in trouble. They don't care about the quote-unquote Islamists. They struck this deal. You can go and read about it. If you're interested, back in the 1970s, they let the Islamists do whatever they want because they pay them, but in exchange, you don't question it whenever they get to party on yachts and drink champagne. And that's the deal. That's how it's been for a long time. With this type of stuff, though, anything with ethno-religious tones, like specifically with the Palestinians, that is a major threat to their regime because they're going to be viewed as weak by their own population, and they could possibly, have some sort of Islamist takeover. So that is the main motivation for them. They don't care about the Palestinians at all. But when they're coming here, they're basically, and this has been communicated, in all the leaks that are happening behind the scenes, they're like, if you guys do not put pressure on the Israelis, we are going to be forced to do something. Now, we don't know what that something it looks like. And that's the main reason, I think, why we keep getting all these leaks, Krystal, like this one we can put up there on the screen. It's like we read this every day now. White House preps for broader war as concerns rise. And again, it's just like the Ukrainians. It's like, well, we wish they wouldn't use the missiles in Russia, but what can you do? I'm like, well, you could stop giving it to them. And they're like, oh, no, that would be too crazy. They specifically cite the Saudi defense minister coming on Monday. They also cite all of these calls going on behind the scenes between the Secretary of Defense and the Israeli defense minister about the Israeli intelligence services, quote, which they say believe that Hezbollah will increase the intensity of its attacks against Israel on its northern border because of the Israeli ground operation inside of Gaza. Israeli officials think Hezbollah will try to escalate without leading to an all-out war that could easily get out of control. But, just think about the gray line that is. It's like, oh, well, we're going to escalate right up to the line. Well, who knows? We've already seen multiple instances of failures. We've seen, Israeli bombs go off of target and kill a bunch of civilians. We saw the Israelis accidentally fire at the Egyptians. It only takes one. It takes one missile to go one wrong way and kill the wrong person, and now you're in a full-blown war and you don't even know what the hell happened before that even occurred. So behind the scenes, it's very clear that the West Wing is freaking out. We brought you, everybody, the news on Saturday about the White House was like, hey, just call off the invasion. They're like, don't do a full-scale ground invasion. Just do what we did in Iraq, like joint surgical operations, special forces. But what you guys are about to do, we really don't want you to do it. But then they did it anyway, or at least the tanks are going in. There's a lot of negotiations going on behind the scenes. And every statement now from the White House, Krystal, is basically like, we need to respect humanitarian law. We need to respect civilians. And even it's not about, even at this point, like, of course, they're not going to change anything in terms of actual policy, but the fact that they keep saying it over and over again is also just an indication of how worried they are about spiraling of escalation.
Absolutely. And they should be.
Yeah.
They're worried about that. They're very worried about, public opinion here, which is already shifting. And, the view of younger generations on this conflict is very different from older generations. And guess what? Young people are a critical part of the Democratic coalition. So I wish I could say, like, oh, they're really concerned about the babies on the incubators and the kids being pulled out of the rubble. But let's be honest, like, the concern is political. And the concern also has to do with they're not fools. They know what war with Iran would be and that it would be an utter catastrophe and complete nightmare. So, that's why we keep getting these reports. Again, this is more of the hand-wringing, like, oh, we're so worried about what they're doing, but, we're not going to draw any red lines or actually do anything. Have you seen, Saagar, there's this video that came out that's been confirmed of Netanyahu it was from many years ago, like probably 20 years ago, when he thought that the mics and the cameras were off. And he gets asked about, how to deal with the Palestinian issue. And he's talking about how you go and you hit them hard. And someone asked him, like, well, aren't you worried about what the Americans will say?
I've seen this clip. Yeah, this is famous.
And he's like, oh, well, I understand how America
he said, America's
works.
easy. It was something like that.
He says basically, like, they're very easy to persuade and very easy to maneuver. So basically, he's like, no, they give us carte blanche and they're always going to. And you know what? He's been 100% correct. Just to show you how serious this is, and it's not just leaks to Axios, take a look at the military assets which are moving. Put this up on the screen. We've got this graphic here, 24 hours of U.S. and allied transport aircraft moving from the continental U.S. to the eastern Mediterranean, CENTCOM, including both the U.S. and the U.K. Transports. So you can see a lot of activity here. And this person says this is far from a complete list, does not include tankers or other types of aircraft. So we already knew about the carrier groups that had moved to the region. This also shows you some of the air assets that have moved to the region. Now, they would probably say, oh, this is part of deterrence. We're trying to avoid this wider conflict. But, there's also this fine line between deterrence and provocation. And, anytime you see this amount of military firepower moving to one region, you have to ask, what is this leading towards? And, one thing that really, from this particular Axios report that we had up, one line, Saagar, that really stuck with me is they had an official who said they continue to believe that diplomacy and Biden's experience can still help prevent worst case scenarios. However, they think that the most pessimistic outcome is the most likely outcome.
Oh, absolutely. I agree with that too. I mean, I like to think of things in terms of systems. Think about the American political system as it is current, not as we wish, as it is currently constructed. There is no scenario where Joe Biden is going to do anything to constrain Israeli military operations without freaking out the entire Democratic Republican establishment. He'd probably be censured by his own party. And it would be, it would be interesting if he were to do it, but he's not going to do it. He doesn't have that kind of courage. He's only displayed it one time in his life with Afghanistan, took such a beating, he's probably never going to do it again. And this is 10x more powerful in terms of that lobby. Then think about the Israeli political system. How can anyone in the Israeli political system at this current moment, especially a guy named Bibi Netanyahu, who the day the military operation stops, he is going to get, destroyed for allowing this to happen and for splitting the country apart, where already the security apparatus and everybody was allied against him. It's in his direct interest to keep this thing going as long as possible. And then let's think about Hamas's political interest. They didn't launch this attack because, they were afraid of retaliation. They're like bin Laden. Yeah. They want Israel to come in and blow the shit out of Gaza because that helps increase their message.
They want the broader war.
They want the war. The war is good for them.
Yeah.
And so all three systems, each one, there is no exerting pressure that can keep us away from that. And look, the most pessimistic outcome is the most likely. You should always, and I wish it were different. We're going to sit here. We've given so many alternate viewpoints on this, but we cannot pretend that these viewpoints have any power in Washington at the current moment. The only good thing, I guess you can say, about crisis is things move very, very quickly. So 2 weeks from now, who the hell knows what kind of world that we are living in? And sometimes discourse is much more relevant. But as things stand right now, I don't see a single off-ramp on this entire thing. I really don't.
Yeah, that is certainly what it looks like. Hey guys, if you like that video, go to breakingpoints.com, become a premium subscriber, and help us build the best independent media organization on the planet.
That's right. We're subscriber funded. We're building something new. We want to replace these failing mainstream media organizations.
So again, to subscribe, it's breakingpoints.com.